In this talk, I'm going to be going through the basic principles and practices of shamanism, and in particular, the version I practice myself and teach and write about, which is Therapeutic Shamanism, and talk about its significance to our modern day life. So, what do we mean by the word shamanism? The word shaman originally comes from the 𝗀𝗍𝗄𝗿 people of the Siberia-Mongolia region. Let me just close that a little bit so it's out your way. And it means one who knows, or one who can see things in the dark. Basically, someone who can see the things that other people can't see or don't even want to see. And the word entered the English language sometime during the 1600s, it seems. And it's not, of course, unusual for languages to borrow words from other cultures. I mean, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of words in English that originated in other cultures. But that's true of any language. Any language will take things from other cultures. That's what languages do. Now, there are people who, a minority of people, but there are people who say that the word shaman should only be used when talking about the 𝗀𝗍𝗄𝗿 people's spiritual practices. However, as is usual with words, the meaning has changed over the years. And these days, the word shaman, we use the word shaman to describe a type of indigenous spiritual practice that is found in different forms, but throughout the world. It's no longer a word term that's just confined to the 𝗀𝗍𝗄𝗿 spiritual practices. Now, exactly which indigenous practices count as being shamanic and which don't is far from settled, and is the subject of lively debate in shamanic circles sometimes. However, what we do all agree on in the shamanic community is that shamanism is part of animism, and so if we're going to understand shamanism, we have to start really with looking at what animism is. So the first thing I need to say about animism, and the most important thing to understand about it, is that it is not a religion. It is a spiritual practice, but it is not a religion in that it is not based on any faith or belief. There's no leap of faith required in it. You don't have to take things on faith. Instead, animism is based on very direct personal experiences. These are the experience that everything is alive. Now, when animists talk about experiencing everything being alive, they literally mean everything. They don't differentiate like we tend to do in the West between living and non-living things. So for animists, it's not just animals that are alive or plants, it's also the mountains and the river and the waterfall and the rocks and even the wind. Everything in animism is experienced as being alive. Now, if things are alive, it at least begs the or allows the possibility that they could be communicated with. And again, this is what animists experience, that they can actually communicate with these other living, non-human living things. And in doing so, the animist experience is that everything has its place and its value. More than that even, that everything is actually sacred. Animists talk about Great Spirit, that everything is an expression of Great Spirit. So their experience of the world is non-hierarchical. Certainly humans are not the pinnacle of evolution. It's much more, rather than a hierarchical experience of the world, they much more experience it as like a round table, where everybody has their place around it. And they also experience the world as being highly interconnected, that everything is part of a web of life, a web of community, a whole ecology. They live with an experience of ecology, an ecosystem, in a way that most Western humans are very cut off from. And they understand that humans' survival, in fact, the survival of almost anything, depends on this interconnectedness and on understanding it and honouring it. So shamanism is a part of animism. So shamans experience all the things that animists do, this sense of aliveness and interconnectedness and this web of community. The shaman, though, also has some additional abilities. Somebody has the ability to leave their body and travel what are known as the shamanic realms. We'll be looking at what they are shortly. And in doing this, they can communicate with the other than human. Traditionally, they did this for a number of reasons. So some of the earliest evidence we have of shamanism, like cave paintings, the cave paintings usually depict shamanic practices, and they often also depict hunting scenes. And we know from current animist cultures that shamanism is often used to help with the hunt, essentially to help with human survival. Another big part of shamanism is healing. We'll be looking at this again shortly, but it's a major part of shamanic practice is to help heal people and understanding why people get sick and what can be done about that shamanically. It's also used in cultures to protect people, to protect individuals or the tribe from animists may believe in evil spirits and so on. One of the most important parts of shamanism to me, though, is that it is about acquiring knowledge and wisdom. So a lot of people focus on the healing aspect of shamanism, and certainly that is enormously important. But alongside that, and important for me, is this acquisition of knowledge and wisdom. Because shamanism isn't just about what shamans do in terms of healing and so on, it's also about their role in a society. And the shamans were the wisdom keepers in animist cultures. It was their job to be able to communicate with the other than human and to try to keep a balance, because shamans understood that humans can get lost and sort of lose right ways of being and right ways of living. And so it was the job of the shaman to keep the tribe and the community on the right track, to help the humans to live in right relationship, both with each other as other humans, to help the tribe to function well, but also so that the tribe was living in right relationship with the other human, other than human too. So the animals, the plants in the environment, but also in right relationship with the river environment and so on. So, where is shamanism from if it's not just from the 𝗀𝗍𝗿𝗄 people? Shamanism has literally been practiced all over the world wherever humans have settled. And this is because before agriculture, which we started to develop in a sort of large scale way around 11,000 BC, but before that, all human beings lived as hunter-gatherers. And all hunter-gatherer tribes that we know anything about, and we know about thousands and thousands of hunter-gatherer tribes. All hunter-gatherer tribes practiced animism / shamanism. So shamanism doesn't belong to any particular human culture. No one culture can claim it. It's basically universal to human experience. Now, there's an anthropologist called Michael Harner, who died a couple of years ago, but he studied different shamanic cultures, and in doing so, he began to realize that all had a remarkably similar set of experiences, understandings, and practices. Now, obviously, different cultures, given animism as a sort of nature-based spiritual practice, different cultures would obviously work with different animals and different plants depending where they lived. But if you took away that kind of surface layer, underneath it was this very consistent set of experiences and practices. To the extent you could take a shaman from Siberia and sit them down with an interpreter with a shaman from Peru, and they would be able to discuss very, very similar practices and understandings. So Harner coined the phrase core shamanism, and in 1980 he wrote a book called The Way of the Shaman, where he described these core practices. And what Harner found is that essentially what tribes do is they take these core practices and understanding based on their experiences, and they simply adapt it to the time and place they live in, because shamanism is a highly practical form of spirituality with practical applications. So there's this deep, ancient, underlying set of principles called core shamanism. And what Harner did was he started to teach these in their sort of stripped down form. Because around this time, shamanism was in crisis. Indigenous cultures were being decimated. Very few actually genuine hunter-gatherer cultures still survived. And where they did, shamanism had often come under persecution from religions, also from communism in Russia, things. And shamanism was on the verge, potentially, of actually dying out altogether. And the fact that you're sat listening to this and that I'm doing this talk in many, many ways is because of Harner. You probably would not have heard of shamanism if it hadn't been for Harner bringing it together again and starting to teach it again, because the resurgence of shamanism we're seeing in the West is largely down to him in many ways. So I just wanted to acknowledge our sort of debt of gratitude to him, and my personal thanks to him as well. So I said this is an ancient thing. So how old is it? Let's put this in a context. So if we think about the existing religions, the organized religions, the oldest existing ones are probably the Hindu or Jain religions, which are roughly 3,500 years old. Then we've got Buddhism, Taoism, and Shinto, which are roughly 2,500 years old. Christianity, around 2,000 years old, of course. Islam, 1,400 years. The oldest probable evidence we have of shamanism, as I mentioned, are the cave paintings. So the ones in Europe, for instance, go back to around 33,000 BC. And like I said, these depict shamanic practices. Most people agree. Now, that is vastly, vastly older, obviously, than existing modern religions. And there's some tentative evidence that would make shamanism much older still. So in a place in South Africa called the Blomberg Cave, there's a piece of yellow ochre rock been found, sort of it's about that long, and it's got geometrical carvings on it. And the academic consensus is largely that this is probably some kind of spiritual ritual object, in which case it would be a shamanic object, given that it's from hunter-gatherer cultures. And this has been carbon dated to being around 77,000 years old. And also, just a couple of years or so ago, in the Blomberg Caves, they found what seemed to be the remains of a place where body paint was being made. Now, in hunter-gatherer cultures, body painting is rarely just used purely for adornment. It usually has some spiritual significance. It's usually used in shamanic or animist ceremonies. And this, in the Blomberg Cave, has been dated to 100,000 years old. So this makes shamanism incredibly ancient. If you ask shamans how long we've been practicing shamanism, though, or how old it is, they would find it a strange question, because to them it's not like a religion. It's not like something people opted into or opted out of. It was literally how they experienced the world. It's what it was to be human to them. This makes it shamanism as old as human beings themselves. It is a way of being. It's a way of experiencing the world that until quite recently is how we all experience the world in terms of this larger scale of human history. Let's put this in a context. So modern humans, Homo sapiens, us, we're somewhere between 160 to 200,000 years old as a species. Let's keep the figures rounded. So let's say 200,000 years old. Modern humans, to the extent that if you had a time machine and went back to 200,000 years ago, these people you would recognize as being the same as us, essentially. Now, in tribal cultures, say you'd have had your kids by the age of 20. So that's 5 generations every 100 years. So 200,000 years is 10,000 generations of your ancestors. Not 10,000 ancestors, 10,000 generations of them. So if you imagine a line of 10,000 people stood behind you, each one representing a whole generation of ancestors. So I did the maths once. If you allow like a meter for each person, I can't remember what it comes out at, but it's kilometers long, this line. Let's put this in another way. So in the West, say we only stopped practicing it in the last 2,000 years, practicing shamanism. Taking a round figure. So that means 9,900 generations of your ancestors before then still were practicing it. In other words, 99% of the generations of your ancestors practiced shamanism, experienced the world in this shamanic animistic way. This is why many people, when they come back to shamanism, animism, experience it as a homecoming, as something that they knew something was missing but didn't quite know what it was. It's usually a deep sense of familiarity about it. A relief is often how people describe it as well. So let's look a bit more about what it involves. So as I said, it's not religion, it's a way of experiencing the world. And also I said it requires no belief, so it's about direct personal experience. Experience of what? Of spirit, of the spirit world. let's just stay with the direct personal experience for a bit. So in shamanism, there are no priesthoods. There's no hierarchies. There's no temples. There's no sacred buildings. There's no sacred text. There's no equivalent of the Bible or the Torah of the Quran. And so there's no arguments about interpretation of dogma. There's no sects or factions. There have never been wars fought between rival interpretations of shamanism. Compare that to the world's organized religions. So with shamanism, you don't have to go through anybody. You don't have to talk to spirit through the priest, or you don't have to be initiated in that way. It's everybody's birthright to have this direct personal relationship with spirit. So, what is spirit? What do shamans mean by spirit? Some people, spirit is everything. Shamans say that everything is made of great spirit. They also say that everything is made of energy as well, that this spirit is an energy. So shamans have always said that everything is composed of energy. And of course, now from physics, we know that to be true too. Where shamans go further than at least most physicists, though with a couple of interesting examples I'll come to in a moment, shamans not only say that everything is made of energy, but they say that the energy that everything is made of is alive and conscious, and that it can be communicated with. There are, like I say, a couple of interesting physicists who also experience this. One was actually Albert Einstein. Einstein was a self-described animist. He believed that everything in the universe was alive and conscious, that the universe was essentially consciousness. Another physicist, and I've gone out of my head whether it was Niels Bohr or David Bohm, but a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He'd spent 10 years of his life studying plasma, which is the state that light is in something like a star. Things, a state of sort of flux of energy. And he said that after 10 years of studying plasma, he'd reluctantly started to feel that actually plasma had also been studying him. And he said the idea sort of terrified him because the logical conclusion is that that meant the stars were actually conscious because they're made of plasma. They're conscious beings. Now, there's a tribe of animist shamans called the 𝘀𝗵𝗺 who live high up in the mountains in Colombia. And they a while ago decided to come down from the mountains and to warn us about what we are doing to the planet and how we're destroying it. And so there's a documentary film was being made about them. And a while ago there was a clip from this documentary going around YouTube, and it's a 𝘀𝗵𝗺 shaman in conversation with an astrophysicist. And at one point, the physicist is describing theories about dark matter and dark energy, and the shaman already seems to have an understanding of this, and they have their own concepts of this, and it's something they're already familiar with. This is like cutting edge theories in physics. But the really interesting bit is where the astrophysicist brings out a photograph. Now, this photograph has been taken with a deep space telescope, so nothing on here is visible to the human eye. And it just looks like a photograph of thousands and thousands of stars. And what's fascinating is the 𝘀𝗵𝗺 shaman immediately points to one of them and says, oh, that's such and such. The shaman has a name for this particular star. And what amazes the physicist is what the shaman has picked out is the only actual star on the photograph. All the other pinpricks of light are galaxies. So this shaman has been working with and has knowledge of stars that can't be seen with the naked eye, and has a name for them and understands their consciousness. Shamans literally do experience the world as being alive, all of it. So going into this in a bit more depth, shamans say there are two levels of reality. There's two worlds. There's this physical world and the world of spirits. And modern physics says a similar thing in that, for instance, the Nobel Prize winning physicist David Bohm wrote a book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. He talks about the explicate universe, which is this surface physical reality. And this explicate physical reality, he says, is made from blueprints in a far deeper reality that he calls the implicate. In shamanism, this would be the shamanic realms or the realms of spirits. And what Bohm says, and remember, this isn't sort of New Age stuff or spirituality, this is hard physics. He's a physicist and does all the maths with it and things. What Bohm says is that what appears separate in physical reality, when you drop into this deeper reality, the implicate, you realize that everything is in fact actually connected up. Bohm says, this is amazing, that this is true to the extent that every single atom in the universe, every atom in the entire universe is connected up to every other atom. To the extent, he says, that if we only knew how to do it, we could ask any atom what any other atom in the universe, anywhere in the universe, is doing, was doing, and is likely to do next. Try and get your head around that for a minute. The entire universe is connected up by this web of interconnection to that extent. Now, shamans have always known this. They know that in this reality, things appear separate. But if you drop down into shamanic reality, you realize that everything is interconnected. Everything is part of a whole, this web of energy. And what shamans know how to do is to untie themselves from the sense of separateness of this reality and drop down into that web of interconnectedness and travel it. It is known as the Shamanic Journey. We'll come back to that in a moment. And when shamans drop down into that reality, it's like starting off at the tip of a twig on a tree and then moving back along the twig and then eventually to ever converging branches. So let's say this is surface reality. Everything above here is surface reality. Everything below is the deeper reality. So things project up like this. So in surface reality, we experience ourselves as separate individual humans. But if we drop down into shamanic reality, we realize we're all coming from the same branch. We're all part of a whole. Now, our animist ancestors, that's all our ancestors, going back beyond the advent of agriculture, they lived like this with that experience. They both experienced themselves as separate human beings, obviously, with a personality and individuality, but they equally experienced themselves as being part of a whole, part of a tribe. And this is why, or one of the reasons why, in tribal cultures, people rarely have ever had any personal possessions. Everything belonged to tribe, essentially. If they had food, they would share it with the tribe. Because very different to our modern sense of separateness and self-centeredness, they experience themselves as being part of a bigger whole, a bigger tribe, a part of human with a capital H. And more than just human as well. It didn't stop there. So if we, on this surface reality, we experience ourselves as being separate individual humans, but we realize as we drop down and move away from separation, we realize we're all part of human with a capital H. Now, if we did that and we looked to the side, we'd also see individual gorillas, say. And if we look down, we'd see they are part of gorilla with a capital G. And the same with chimpanzees. So there's the individuals in this surface reality, individual gorilla with a small g, but it's part of gorilla as a whole with big G, chimpanzees, and so on. So if we drop down to human, we look across, and close to us there's another branch, gorilla, another branch, chimpanzee. And then if we start to drop deeper down still, these three branches would themselves start to converge, with the bonobos coming in as well. So we'd realise we're on a thicker branch now, part of great ape. And if we looked across, we'd see other branches. We'd see the feline branch. And if we followed that back up, we'd see feline split into the different kinds of cat, into tigers and snow leopards and so on, and then pop up as individuals in the surface reality. Same with the canines, the dog family, and so on. And if we drop down deeper, feline, canine, great ape, all would converge into an even thicker branch called mammal. And that would be next to another branch called bird, another branch called fish, next to reptile, and so on. And if we drop down, then these would start to form a great big thick trunk called animal. And that would be next to a bigger trunk called plant, again with its own branches. And animal and plant, if we drop further down, come from another branch called mineral, or what in shamanism is known as the stone people. And that, if we went further down, we would find emerging from Mother Earth. So in shamanism, everything emerges from Mother Earth and then is part of one great tree, essentially. This is why in shamanic cultures, shamans, animists talk about our brothers and sisters, the animal people, brother wolf, sister bear, and so on. But they talk about the plant people as being our relatives too. They talk about the stone people being our relatives too, the rivers, the mountains, and so on. Everything in creation is part of one interconnected family. And again, just keep reminding yourself, this isn't a belief. This is actually what people are experiencing in their lives, how they experience the world around them. They don't have our modern sense of separation. They feel and live with this sense of interconnectedness. To understand this, we can look at what we know about the two hemispheres of our own brain. So you probably know that our human brain is divided into two halves, two hemispheres. And these organize and experience reality in two quite different ways. The left hemisphere of our brain is hardwired to logic and to the physical world, and it experiences the world as a place of separation and individuality. Whereas the right hemisphere of our brain is hardwired to the artistic and the spiritual. And this includes shamanic reality. This hemisphere of our brain experiences the world as a place of interconnection. And there's an interesting TED talk, I can't remember the woman's name, you'll be able to find it though. She was some kind of neurologist, I think, and she had a stroke, and for a time the left hemisphere of her brain shut down, and she gives a TED talk about this. So for a period of her life, she was living basically with just the right hemisphere of her brain functioning well. And she talks about this experience of everything being connected, of experiencing the world as not lots of separate things, but as a interconnected whole. Interestingly, she also says she experiences it as a loving interconnectedness as well. Now, our ancestors, and remember we're talking about 99% of the generations of our ancestors. We're talking about nearly 200,000 years of our history here, because it's only recently we stopped experiencing the world in this way. Our ancestors experienced the world through both hemispheres equally. In Shamanism, this is sometimes described as walking with one foot in this physical reality, the left hemisphere, and one foot in shamanic reality as well. They experienced a sense of individuality. Obviously, you couldn't function as a person without that, and a sense of interconnectedness, of being an individual and part of human tribe, of being human and part of a greater whole, of this physical reality and the reality of the spirit world as well, or quantum reality, whatever you want to call it. What happened to us, modern humans, and this started to happen as we discovered agriculture, which started around 11,000 BC, but picked up very rapidly around 6,000 years ago with the birth of what ironically we call civilization, and what the author Steve Taylor describes as being the fall. What happened then is that our left hemisphere rose and suppressed and dominated the right. And this led to our modern day culture of disconnectedness, of self-centeredness, of individuality, and what's often described as egomania. And that's where we live these days. So the good news is the right hemisphere of our brain is hardwired to experience interconnectedness and is hardwired to experience shamanic reality. So what shamans do in what's called the Shamanic Journey is they temporarily unhook themselves from this physical reality and put both their feet temporarily into shamanic reality, so that they can start to travel and experience this sense of interconnectedness and this web of life. And in doing so, they can let go of being an individual human, and more than that, they can even let go of their sense of being human and travel down and then emerge up into one of these other branches, essentially. So they can drop down and then go onto the branch of, say, chimpanzee or gorilla, or of wolf or tiger, and so on. So they can experience what it's like to be something else and to communicate with that thing In shamanism, this is known as shape-shifting. Now, when you do this in a shamanic journey, it's very, very different to just doing it as what's often called a guided visualization. It's a much more tangible, visceral experience. You actually experience what it is like to have thick fur all over your body, to have a tail, to have claws, or to have wings and talons or a beak. You can even drop further down. Most people can do that quite easily, actually. I mean, I've taught shamanism to hundreds, possibly thousands of people now, and most people within a few hours can learn to journey to the extent they can actually experience being another animal. With a bit more practice, you can go even further and experience what it's like to be one of the plant people. A lot of people experience trees as being quite easy. And in shamanism, they're often called the standing people to distinguish them from other plants, because particularly old trees, a lot of people recognize they have a palpable personality, a sort of consciousness that they can recognize and communicate with. And to experience being that deeply rooted and that still and that unhurried, that's usually a really powerful experience for people when they journey to shapeshift into being a tree. Harder still is to shapeshift down and experience what it is to be one of the stone people. Partly that's because you have to really not only leave human behind, but leave animal behind, but even the pace of plant, because the stone people move so much more slowly. But if you can really slow yourself down and match that speed, then you can experience what it is like to be the stone people too. To aid with this, the shamanic journey is usually done using what's called a shamanic drum, or sometimes a rattle. The drum is played at a consistent and repetitive beat of around about 3.5 to 4 beats a second. And this particular rhythm is, we know now from science, it rapidly produces theta brainwaves. Theta brainwaves produce a deep meditative, creative, spiritual state in us. And there's been some research that only short periods of time listening to a shamanic journey, shamanic drumming, can produce the same depth of theta brainwaves in inexperienced people as it can take experienced meditators hours to produce. There's something about that rhythm switches us into theta state, and cultures all over the world have understood this. This is why the drum or the rattle or other ways of producing this rhythm, whether it's didgeridoos or click sticks or whatever, have been widely used to aid and facilitate the shamanic journey. There's other ways to journey too. Some cultures will enter trance states through hours and hours of repetitive dancing, through jumping up and down, through repetitive swaying or shaking, sometimes there's seething. Some cultures, of course, do use psychoactive plants as well, things like ayahuasca and things. But actually, the use of plants in that way is not that common in most shamanic cultures. Usually the thing that is used is the drum, though not in all parts of the world. And the drums and rattles have their own healing properties and uses too, as well as being used for the shamanic journey. Now, when shamans drop down into shamanic journeys, they experience shamanic reality as being divided up into three quite distinct realms. Now, part of the problem, as I said, is because we lost shamanism, we've lost our terminology for it as well. So when 𝗁 started to piece things back together, he had to come up with a word for these three realms. So he simply called them, in core shamanism, the upper world, the lower world, and the middle world. And they are three quite distinctly different places. Probably the easiest way for us Westerners to understand the upper world is it's the place we think of as being spiritual. In shamanism, everything is spirit, of course, but it's what most people think of as spiritual, because of course the Christians pinched it and called it heaven, essentially. Now we have to remember that what is there in shamanic reality is it's beyond our comprehension in some ways. What we have to do to interact with shamanic reality, because it is so strange in some ways, is we have to fashion what we experience there into some kind of metaphor, some kind of imagery that we can relate to. And the imagery we use will tend to draw on our own experiences and culture, obviously. So if you are Christian, you might experience the shamanic world as full of Christian imagery, sort of angels and saints and so on. If you were Buddhist, you might experience it as being full of Buddhas and Taras. Hindu gods and so on. So one of the things 𝗁 did was he taught people to journey to the upper world, but without actually telling them anything about what they might experience there. And he recorded these journeys. So he had records of thousands of people's upward journeys, and he sort of analysed, sort of did a meta-analysis. And basically, underneath the surface symbols people are using, so whether it's based on Christian or pagan or Hindu, whatever, there are common experiences of the upper world. It's a place often full of temples, palaces, cathedrals, monasteries, and so on. There's no modern technology experience there, and it's a place where we will meet enlightened beings, for want of a better term. The shamanic lower world, the Christians also pinched, but they told us terrible lies about it. They told us it was hell, and nothing is further from the truth. The reason they did this is because it is the realm of Mother Earth, and Christianity is about Father Sky. It's a sky religion, essentially. And it's a patriarchal religion, not a matriarchal one. The reality is the lower world is if the upper world is the realm of Father Sky, the lower world is the realm of Mother Earth, and it's the realm of nature, of animals, of plants, of geology, of mountains and the sea and so on, and of people who are living in a natural way, hunter-gatherer people, tribal people. When you travel to the lower world, there is no technology there whatsoever, not even agriculture. There's no fences, there's no hedgerows, there's no domesticated animals. It is pure, unspoilt nature. It's where we go to meet what are called our ancestral king, or sometimes just called the ancestors with a sort of capital A in shamanism. These are great human hunter-gatherer teachers who can teach us how to live in harmony with the other than human. And it's a place where we can find help, healing and teaching from animals, from plants, and from stones, from the stone people. If there is a hell, it's where you're sat now. It's the physical middle world. Because unlike the upper and lower worlds, the middle world is a place of potential danger. There's beautiful things in the middle world, but it's also the place where you can get run over by a bus, or you can get cancer, or be attacked, or so on. It's a mixed place. There's two aspects to the middle world shamanically. There's this physical world, and then there's the energy behind it as well. And the most dangerous of those is probably the actual physical middle world. That's where actual harm, physical harm, can come to you. The energetic middle world can also be dangerous, but it also can be a very unsettling place if you're not used to it. So we talk about somebody looking daggers at somebody. If you go into shamanic middle world perception, you will see them looking daggers, or the knife in the back, or the dark cloud around somebody, or why a particular room or building has a strange feel to it. You'll see all this stuff. So the middle world, because it's not necessarily a safe place, and because it can be sometimes deeply disturbing, it's not the place where I suggest people start their shamanic journey at all. It's the place people will naturally gravitate towards because we're used to being in the middle world. But the safest place to start your shamanic journey are the upper and lower worlds, because they are completely safe places. They are places of love and healing. And the way I teach my students first is to think about how a plant grows. Plants are some of our greatest teachers. So the first thing a seed does is it puts its roots down into Mother Earth, and it makes sure it's embedded in the earth, and then it draws Mother Earth up into it. And then it reaches up to Father Sun and draws Father Sun or Father Sky down into it, and only then does it start to grow and expand into the middle world. And this is how we safely should learn shamanism, particularly because, unlike our hunter-gatherer ancestors, most modern humans are deeply unrooted, are deeply cut off from nature, and are living in a particularly crazy human-created middle world. So the way I teach is you start off in the lower world, and once you feel deeply embedded and rooted in the lower world, then you can take your shamanic practice up into the upper world. And once you are also anchored there, then you can safely start exploring the middle world. Part of the reason I'm sort of emphatic about this is I've seen shamanism taught very badly in the West over the years, with very little instruction. And like I say, the tendency is for most people is to stray off into the middle world. And I've seen a lot of people over the years just get freaked out by it and decide, oh, shamanism's not for me, this is too disturbing, things, or get caught up in a lot of murky middle world shamanic practices. And like I said, this is because we're starting from a different place to our hunter-gatherer ancestors who were deeply connected to Mother Earth and also to Father Sky, and had much simpler, less murky middle world lives in the first place. So let's look at some other key shamanic concepts. Very central to shamanism is the idea of soul loss and the practice of soul retrieval. So in a shamanic journey, obviously part of us is leaving our body and traveling different realms. So shamans believe and experience that part of them can leave their body and travel other realms. And actually, we do it all the time. It's what you what you do when you're daydreaming, or sort of your mind's wandered, or when we sleep at night, and so on. So part of us often leave a body. I mean, a lot of modern humans aren't particularly in their bodies in the first place. They're quite ungrounded. When it becomes a problem, though, is when part of us leaves our body and doesn't come back, and this is known as soul loss. Part of our soul has got lost or left. There can be a number of reasons why this would happen. Abuse is one, not just sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental, emotional abuse too. But basically, part of us just can't cope anymore, and so it leaves, it goes. It can happen for some reason, through prolonged anxiety or fear as well. Part of us just disassociates, yeah. It can happen through loss and grief. So when we love somebody, we might entwine part of ourselves with them, part of our soul with them. So when they die or if they betray us, that part of us goes off with them. So people say, ever since they've gone or ever since they left me, it's like a part of me is missing, or there's a hole in my heart, or like the light has gone out of the world or something. Souls can happen through shame and guilt. Again, part of us just can't cope and leaves. It can happen through prolonged pain. Again, part of us just can't cope with it. Chronic pain. It can happen when we give part of ourselves over to others, like in codependent relationships. It can happen particularly when that person dominates us, or when we're dominated by a group. We basically sell ourselves out. We give ourselves to somebody else or the group to fit in or to survive. It can happen through substance abuse and other addictions, where basically our soul gets taken over, essentially. The biggest way soul loss happens in the West, though, is from my experience of being both a shamanic practitioner and a psychotherapist, the biggest thing I see, cause of soul loss in the West, is because in fitting into our modern, domesticated, tamed, mundane lives, we have to send part of ourself away. We certainly have to send our wild hunter-gatherer soul away, but to survive dysfunctional families or school systems that are based on being told to sit down and shut up for hours and hours every day, week in, week out, to fit in with jobs that are soul destroying, we say, or soulless, we send parts of ourselves away. We send away our playfulness, our spontaneity, our assertiveness, our laughter, our vulnerability, all sorts of parts of us, different people send different parts away, obviously. And this creates problems. It creates symptoms of soul loss. I'll run through these quickly, but the symptoms of soul loss are many. So a sense of somehow something being incomplete, that something is missing from us, something's missing in our life. There's an emptiness in us. Feelings of numbness, flatness, apathy, indifference, lack of joy, so going through the motions in life. A sense of just being a bit disconnected from life or what's going around you, not being able to find that sense of connectedness and joy, inspiration, a sense of not really being here, being a bit floaty or ungrounded. Depression, ranging from mild to moderate through to severe. Feeling lost, indecisive, aimless, procrastinating, lack of motivation, lack of confidence, lack of self-belief. Having a strong inner critic who's always putting you down and on your back. Missing memories, like where have they gone? Where's that part? How have those experiences gone? Why have they gone? A lot of people can't remember much about their childhoods and things. So why not? Where's it gone? Yeah. addictions or compulsive behaviours or thought patterns. We're trying to fill our emptiness with something else. A sense of having never really recovered from past experiences, things that still haunt us from the past. Finding us repeatedly returning to a person, location, or behavioral situations that is unhealthy for us. It's almost like we're trying to play something out again and recreate it to make sense of it. Same kind of relationships, behaviors we can't seem to move on from. Finding it hard to reinvest in the future with enthusiasm and optimism after difficult events. Feelings of grief, fear, anxiety, anger that you can't seem to shake off. And lastly, a feeling that soul retrieval may help. That might seem like a strange one, but there's just, I often get approached by people wanting soul retrieval because they just on some level know that part of their soul is gone, that part of them is missing. It's a really common experience, I think, in this culture, that people feel like part of them is somehow missing, that something's wrong. Now, if you look at that list of symptoms, that's kind of like a description of modern day culture, really. I mean, our modern levels of things like depression and anxiety are off this scale in our modern day culture compared to hunter-gatherer cultures. A lot of hunter-gatherer cultures didn't even have a word for anxiety or depression. And they, compared to us, certainly there will be exceptions, but compared to us, anthropologists describe them as having excellent mental health. I've often been the most chilled out, most content, at ease people you could wish to meet, essentially. And this is because when we killed our shamans, or turned away from shamanism, we also lost the knowledge of soul retrieval, how to heal soul loss. I'll come to that in a moment. And so modern human culture, modern civilization we are riddled with soul loss in a way that hunter-gatherer cultures would find astonishing, or do find astonishing. Because in hunter-gatherer cultures, when somebody suffered soul loss, it would be treated very, very quickly by the shaman, or even the whole tribe would come together for days on end, if necessary, till somebody was better. Nowadays, we've lost the knowledge of soul retrieval. We don't even understand what's going on. And we are riddled with it now. So, to treat soul loss, which, like I say, is epidemic at the moment, it begs the question, where do soul parts go when they leave? Some parts may stay in the middle world. Quite often they are still stuck back in the time and place when the trauma happened, or the unhappy events, or whatever. So PTSD is an obvious example of this. So someone is having flashbacks to something that happened. It's almost like part of the soul is still back there in that time and place. Yeah. Or complex PTSD, just unhappy childhoods, unhappy events, unhappy marriages or relationships. Part of us is still back there. Sometimes the parts leave and go to the upper or lower worlds, and you'll find them being looked after by helpful spirits there. And sometimes they leave and go to what in shamanism is called the land of the dead, where the dead are meant to go. So soul retrieval is when a shaman journeys, so the shaman leaves their body and they ask their shamanic guides to help them find where the soul part has gone to, and then persuade that soul part to return to the person and then literally put it back into the person's body. Just want to mention some other key shamanic concepts. Shamans say we get ill primarily initially for one of two reasons. One is soul loss, but there is power loss. The symptoms of power loss are the same symptoms as soul loss, but the cause is disconnection from the more than human. It's disconnection from nature, disconnection from Mother Earth, essentially, and also from Father Sky, from Spirit, but it's primarily disconnecting ourselves from the tree of life that I was talking about earlier. It's falling into the experience of separation and isolation. It's not a great analogy, but power loss weakens us. The reason they call it power loss is because literally it weakens our vital force, our energy. You know, it's a bit like the difference in if you unplug your phone from the national grid, think about the difference, the amount of power your phone has, that little battery, compared to the power of a whole country's national grid. Yeah, you've unplugged yourself from an enormous source of power, of vitality. There's lots of research coming out these days about how nature heals us, how even just 10, 15 minutes in nature, people start to feel better. It lowers people's anxiety levels, lowers blood pressure, can help with depression, all sorts of things. It's because that's what we're meant to be, is an interconnected animal. We're meant to be part of life. Yeah, it's unnatural for us and makes us ill to disconnect ourselves in the way that we have. Hunter-gatherer ancestors, of course, never suffered power loss. They lived in the natural world and lived with this sense of interconnectedness. But these days, of course, most people have very little connection with nature. And even if they go out for a walk, they, quite often ignoring what's around them. Sort of talking about, he did this and I did that, and or something on their phone or whatever. We live lives that are profoundly disconnected from the other than human these days. And so again, we're a whole culture of people suffering power loss as well. We're suffering little soul loss and power loss. And the problem is, shamans understood that soul loss and power loss leave us weak. It's like having a weakened immune system. It leaves holes in us and things. Things can get into us. Different shamanic animist cultures have different ideas about what these things could be. So some tribal cultures, particularly places like Papua New Guinea and things, tended to have very strong beliefs in evil spirits and so on, so that they were constantly almost sort of having to watch their power and energy and sort of fend off evil spirits getting into them. Other cultures tended to be more relaxed about it. As both a psychotherapist and a shamanic practitioner, it's something I've gone backwards and forwards with, this idea of what gets into us. Are evil spirits or what other things? And it's up to you to really sort of think that through for yourselves. But I have to say my personal experience is the main thing that gets into us in this culture are thought forms. These may be personal things, from childhood, from dysfunctional families, sort of bad parenting, from teachers and so on. So things like you're stupid, yeah, you're unlovable, yeah, you're too big for your boots, you're too this, you're too that, something. So in psychotherapy, we call them introjects, literally the things that get thrown into us, we kind of swallow them. There can be more to do with family scripts. There can be more wider cultural things. So things like religions might give us, things like Catholic guilt, for instance. So thought forms. Now, the society we live in, like I said, most people know deep down that they're full of holes and something's missing. And the society we live in also, things like politicians, capitalism, advertising, and so on, understands this perfectly well as well. So feeling a sense of emptiness in your life, buy this handbag or this car, that will make you feel better. That's the way advertising works in the West. Feeling a lack in your life, buy this thing. Yeah. So we know there's an emptiness in us, and we're told that this will make us feel better, and then it doesn't. Yeah. And so we have to try another thing and another thing. Politicians do it as well. Feeling a sense of emptiness in your life, vote for me. Yeah. Or blame these people, or think this thought. Religions do it as well, of course. And so our modern day life, full of soul loss and power loss, holes in us and full of intrusions, things that possess us, whether that's possess us in the sense of an evil spirit or just things that take us over, things like watching the TV, too much TV. Social media possesses a lot of people, substance addiction, compulsive shopping, all sorts of things. None of which you see in hunter-gatherer cultures, of course. The other thing that when we have poor boundaries and are weak, we can get entangled with other things as well. So we live in a culture full of entanglements. We get entangled in other people's lives in a way that hunter-gatherer people just didn't seem to do. We gossip. We watch soap operas. We get entangled with possessions, physical possessions like our car or all sorts of things, our identity, our status, and so on. And the last thing I want to mention, just briefly, is Shams also understood that we're not separate beings, and we are affected by our ancestors, and we will affect the generations after us as well. So central to shamanic cultures was to think about how you lived your life and how this would affect your children's 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 children, and so on. I mean, most people barely think about their children these days. We're destroying the planet and living in a way that's without thought to the generations after us. But also we are affected by the generations who came before us. And again, modern science is catching up with this now. So the science of epigenetics, we know that mental, emotional, spiritual traumas that happened to people generations ago can still have an impact on us now. And shamans, again, have always understood this. And so healing ancestral wounds is always been a part of shamanic understanding, the need to do that. So what's shamanism for? It's for healing. That's a big part of it. It's also for personal and spiritual development. It isn't, though, a path of purely personal development. There are no examples in hunter-gatherer cultures that I've ever come across of a shaman who's like a hermit, who has decided to renounce the world and human society and just work on their own spirituality. What shamanism is a path of service. So shamans do go off to do their things, their weird shamanic journeys and practices and commune with mountains and so on. But it's to bring the gifts back to their culture. It is very much a role in society. It's a role of service. It's an embodied practice as well. There's no renouncing of the body or the material. It is an embodied practice. It's a path of heart, of compassion. It's a path of service to spirit and of being true to your soul, the thing that you were meant to be as well, and finding what that is and how you can contribute to the world. Because essentially it's a path of right relationship. It's about experiencing a deep sense of interconnectedness. Now, I'm a psychotherapist as well. So if I find myself being judgmental with a client and I can kind of catch myself thinking that was a stupid thing to do. Well, why on earth did they do that? What I've done is I've lost my sense of connection with them. So what I will do is all therapists be familiar with, but essentially it's like a shamanic shapeshift. I will try to listen to them more carefully, understand them from the inside out. What would it be like to have walked in their shoes, to have experienced their childhood, to have been faced with the things they've had to face? And when you do that as a therapist, the empathy comes back again, the judgments fall away. And there's times where even the sense of us being two separate humans can fall away. There's Carl Rogers, a founder of counselling, described it as a sense of presence happens. There's a kinship happens. Now, if you have experienced being the waterfall, or being the mountain, or being that tree, being the rock, being the wolf, that will bring again with it this sense of kinship, this sense of empathy. So this is why, going back to what I said right at the beginning, shamanism is not a belief, it's an experience. So shamans experienced a kinship with life because they experienced this interconnectedness and the empathy that comes with it. So, why we need shamanism back? You're probably aware that Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, quotes that primitive people, as we used to call them as well, savages, as we used to call them, lived lives that were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This belief in primitive, brutish savages, of course, was a convenient story for colonialisation. It justified colonialists marching into other people's lands and saving them from themselves, from their savagery, and civilizing them. It's utter nonsense, and it's what Daniel Quinn, the author, calls the Great Forgetting. What he means by this is hunter-gatherer cultures were not without their own problems, of course. It's a life that could be very tough, and they certainly weren't saints or entirely peaceful people, and they had to face diseases without antibiotics and so on. But a lot of the idea we have about them isn't true at all. They weren't solitary at all. In fact, they were the opposite. We know now from anthropology that they were highly cooperative people. In fact, the phrase fiercely egalitarian has been coined by anthropologists. They enjoyed an enormous amount of personal freedom. Decisions were generally made by consensus. They weren't subjects to rulers. They enjoyed, as I said, enormously good mental health on the whole. Obviously, again, exceptions to this, but again and again, the accounts of anthropologists are these people, hunter-gatherers, were a joy to be around. They were calm, they were peaceful, they laughed more than anybody else they'd ever met. They were at ease with themselves and so on. They also, of course, and this is really important, were living lives that were ecologically sustainable. Compare this to modern civilization. Now, obviously, there are a lot of benefits to it. I mean, I'd be dead now if it wasn't for modern medicine. 3 times now. I've had my life saved by modern medicine. I'm glad to live in a time where there's antibiotics where I need them. I'm glad to live with access to excellent dental care if I'm in pain, and so on and so on. I'm sitting here being able to talk to people all over the world through the marvels of the internet and so on. I enjoy having a shower and access to running water and so on and so on. It all comes with costs though as well. We live in a society that is enormously unequal. Well, I think it's 6 people own 51% of the world's wealth, where there are thousands of billionaires, and yet people are homeless and dying of starvation and so on. We live in a culture where mental health is at crisis levels. Anxiety, depression, suicides and so on. All sorts of things. But the biggest thing, of course, is we are living in an ecological catastrophe. We have 190,000 years, 200,000 years of sustainable hunter-gatherer society. And in the short 6,000 years ago of what we strangely call civilization, a tiny period of human history, it's led to what is now known as the Anthropocene extinction event, or the Holocene extinction. Geological time periods were usually, up until recently, they were caused by huge geological events, things like mass volcanoes and tectonic plate shifts and so on. We are now shaping the world to such an extent. Geologists have called this the Anthropocene age, the Holocene age. And extinction levels now, there's always extinctions going on, it's a natural process, but above and beyond what is natural, it's a human created extinctions. The estimates vary from between 20 to 200 species a day going extinct because of human intervention activity. That's a staggering figure. It's not sustainable. I'm sure if you're listening to this and interested in shamanism, animism, you understand that how we are living now is not sustainable. And it's because we've broken our healthy relationship with the world around us. Hunter-gatherers say we've gone insane. And that's not just a figure of speech. They really do mean we have gone insane. So if we're going to survive, and remember, it's not just us that are in danger here. I often hear people in spiritual communities say, oh, well, it'll all be fine because life, even if if we wipe ourselves out, life will carry on. Well, it will, yeah. But we are set to take down up to 90% of the animal and plant species on the planet with us. And that's just not right. So if we're going to save ourselves and we're going to save the animal and plant species around us, we need to reclaim this ancient indigenous wisdom, this shamanic, animist, whatever you want to call it, wisdom, and learn to live in right relationship again with the world around us. Legislation can only go so far. I mean, we can pass laws about it, and we need to do these things. Obviously, we need to protect the environment and to, stop consuming so much, and everything we can do, we need to do. Yeah, but it's not. Those external things aren't going to be enough, because fundamentally, if we're really going to survive, we have to change ourselves as well. We have to change the way we experience the world again. We have to reclaim our sanity, our birthright. We have to regain that sense of connection and the empathy that comes with that. Hunter-gatherer cultures, there are some examples of them having wiped out individual species, but we have no example of hunter-gatherer cultures who destroyed an entire environment that they lived in. Once civilization starts, city-state cultures, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of examples of city-states destroying the environment they lived in, which should be a big, wake-up call and lesson for us, because we're about to do it on a mass scale. Okay. modern civilization is destructive, yeah, and so we have to go back to reclaim that indigenous wisdom. However, we face new challenges in doing that. So we have to do what our ancestors have always done, which is take this ancient wisdom and this experience of interconnectedness and make it applicable to the world we're in. But we are living in a different world. And one of the challenges that we face is that modern civilization has changed us. It's changed the way we experience the world. Now, that's not an issue traditional shamans ever had to face. It's a new thing. How we are now is new, basically. This sense of separation, disconnection, that isn't something indigenous shamans ever had techniques for. It's not something they needed to treat in that way or to that extent. What we have got, though, is psychotherapy, which has emerged in the last 100 years, 150 years or so, and is specifically about repairing the psychological damage that results from the way we're living now. And psychotherapy and shamanism have a great deal they can learn from each other. And I think if we're going to survive, need to learn from each other. I just want to give you a couple of quick examples, really. One thing is soul loss. So indigenous people might have suffered soul loss through a bereavement or something. And so the shaman would come and find the soul part and bring it back. And the indigenous person would have no hesitation about wanting the soul back. And that's because hunter-gatherer cultures, people didn't suffer soul loss. They were based on the opposite. They were based on helping people blossom into what they were meant to be. It was in the interests of the tribe that the individuals in it were happy and thriving and blossoming and cooperative, essentially. Now, as I said, to fit in with modern cultures, so dysfunctional families, schooling, jobs and so on, we send part of ourselves away often, or lots of parts of ourselves away, and suffer soul loss. So now it's a problem that hunter-gatherers never had to face. So I've oftentimes seen people say that they want soul loss, soul retrieval, because they know part of them's missing. But the problem is, although the shamanic practitioner can bring the soul part back, part of the person doesn't want it back as well, the part that sent that part away. So do you really want your confidence back, your playfulness, your cheekiness, your vulnerability back? What would happen to your relationship, to your family relationships, to your relationship to your boss at work and things if these parts came back? It's a huge problem now. Soul loss, soul retrieval can't be done in the way it used to be done. So this is where psychotherapy can come in, because we can also now negotiate with these parts and come to an agreement, basically. And there's lots of therapies are based on negotiating between what are called parts of self and so on that we can draw on. Another example is goes back to evil spirits and so on. So the default position of indigenous shamans is, because people were healthy, essentially. So if somebody was troubled, it was a fairly reasonable assumption to make that actually it was an evil spirit. Nowadays, because we suppress parts of ourselves, sometimes when people are hearing voices, it's not an evil spirit, it's a part of themselves that they've dissociated from. So if somebody goes to a shaman and the shaman says, oh no, yes, those voices are definitely evil spirits. If they are evil spirits, that's fine, they can get rid of them. But what if they're actually dissociated parts of self? Yeah? To tell a person that those parts are evil is going to do even more damage. The default position of psychotherapists, though, is to not believe in evil spirits and to think that everything is a disowned part of self. And so you might dialogue with those parts of self and learn to integrate them again. That's all fine and good if they are parts of self, but what if it actually is an evil spirit? You don't want to be integrating that. So one of the things we need to shamanism and psychotherapy need to learn from each other is not to make assumptions that sometimes therapy is needed and sometimes shamanic work is needed, and sometimes the two overlap. Same as traditional medicine and modern medicine and shamanism. Shamans weren't stupid. They understood sometimes when they needed a fungal foot cream and other times when they needed shamanic healing. Each has its place, essentially. And psychotherapy has its place, shamanism has its place. Lots and lots of other ways as well, but shamanism and psychotherapy can contribute so much to each other, and together can be much more effective. And the point is much more applicable to the world we are living in now and the challenges we face, hence therapeutic shamanism. One last thing to finish on. Shamanic practitioner or shaman? That 𝘀𝗵𝗺𝗁𝗲 shaman who could communicate with stars and knew about stars that couldn't even be seen with the naked eye, and needed deep space telescope. Scientists needed deep space telescope to see. That's a shaman. Okay, and to get to that point, he would have been raised as a child, devoting 24/7 to shamanic practices, and being trained by people who had done the same before him, and so on. Most people in the West come to shamanism later in their lives. Most people don't have the luxury of devoting all their time to it. It's usually some part-time activity. Most people have to have other jobs and go to the supermarket and so on and so on. Most people are never in the West going to become shamans. To claim a Westerner to claim they're shaman, Michael Harner, who founded core shamanism, said is to just not get what actually an indigenous shaman is. It's to not get the enormous amount of skill and knowledge and experience that that person has. And so he suggested that it was disrespectful to Westerners to start calling themselves shamans. And so he came up with the term shamanic practitioner instead. So it's a bit like everybody can practice Buddhism, not everybody's going to become a Buddha. That's kind of the difference. So I do regularly come across Westerners claiming that they're shamans and so on, and it's up to you what term you want to use. But what I teach and what I practice is Westerners, we're shamanic practitioners basically, we're practicing this. I would never call myself a shaman, because I'm never going to be what that 𝘀𝗵𝗺𝗁𝗲 shaman is or was. And so personally, Westerners who call themselves shamans, I tend to stay clear of. So we've come to the end of the talk. Now I know people usually, from giving this talk a lot, people usually have a lot of questions they want to ask. And so I do just want to be clear, because I get a lot of emails from people at times who've read my books or heard about me through other ways, wanting me to answer questions sort of, through email or whatever. And I'm sorry, I just genuinely don't have the time to answer questions about shamanism by email or online. You will find much more detail and information in my books, though. Often the questions people are asking, the answers are in those books, the ones that are out even just so far. And what you can also do, if you want to explore this more, which I hope you do, is sign up for the online courses. And on the online courses, you will get a lot of time and opportunity to ask the tutor questions as well. So if you want to explore more, you can head over to the website www.therapeutic-shamanism.co.uk, and you'll find links to the books and also to or the online courses we offer. We offer a great range of courses, from beginners courses right through to covering the whole gamut of therapeutic shamanism, including being actually learning to be a shamanic therapist, so to do this professionally with people as well. So thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and hopefully you'll want to explore further. Okay, I'm going to finish now.